Hey guys, so I wanted to take you guys to a passage in Acts 23 today, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 5. But just to kind of give you some context of what's leading up to this, in Acts 21, Paul returns from one of his missionary journeys to Jerusalem, and at this time he starts preaching the gospel. He starts preaching to all these people about the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. The Pharisees don't believe that he is. They stir up a riot at one of Paul's meetings, and basically the people start viewing Paul as a heretic, and kind of this riot ensues, and Rome steps in because they don't care anything about the Jewish religion or the Christian religion. They don't care anything about it. They just don't want a riot taking place in their town. So they step in, they take custody of Paul, they take him into the barracks, and they're like, hey, what's all this about? And it's basically decided that they're going to take Paul before the Pharisaical council and say, hey, what is it that you guys are arguing about? So Rome is kind of trying to play the arbitrator here and trying to quell this this riot so that it doesn't occur again. So in Acts 23, verse 1, he says, and looking intently at the council, Paul said, brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? And those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So, a couple things that I wanted to kind of point out here. The first one being that I want you to see this contrast between Paul and the Pharisees. Both of these individuals were brought up under the Pharisaical interpretation of Judaism. Paul was essentially a Pharisee. He was trained by a very well-known and prominent Pharisaical teacher named Gamaliel. So Paul, for all intents and purposes, is a Pharisee, but he believes that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Judaic religion, and as a result of that, they view him as a heretic because they don't think that's the case. The point being is that Paul is filled with the Holy Spirit. One of the things that Jesus had talked about was that when the Holy Spirit comes, the Holy Spirit would be coming to convict the world of sin. And we saw previously on that Paul was filled with the Holy Spirit previously in the book of Acts. And now it is he's confronted with sin. Now, what was Paul's sin? Well, Paul's sin was to speak evil of a ruler. But Ananias, who was also highly religious and highly zealous towards his belief in the Judaic religion, he says he's confronted with his sin. And what was his sin? Well, it was having Paul struck before he had been properly judged. He was basically brought in custody, and Paul begins to give an account of the charges that are being brought against him. And before he can even finish giving an account, Ananias has him punched in the mouth, basically telling him to shut up, which was in violation to the law as well. And Paul brings this to Ananias's and to the people's attention, and he says, you're standing here to judge me according to the law, yet you're violating the law while you do it. Now, when confronted with their sin, I want you to see their response. Their response was not one of, you're right, my bad, we got caught up in it, go ahead, you can continue. Their response was to throw another section of the law as like, how dare you rebuke the high priest, and so on and so forth, which Paul had technically done. He had violated the law in that respect. But Paul is being confronted by these individuals who just previously had just tried to mob him and kill him. So it's not like Paul has any kind of rapport with them or anything like that. But despite the fact that Paul doesn't like the messenger per se, he still acknowledges the fact that, you know what, my bad, you're right, I did speak evil of a ruler. And he even goes on to quote the section of the law that says that you're not to speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, here's what I wanted to kind of highlight. It's the difference between an individual who is filled with the Holy Spirit and who is confronted with their sin, regardless of the audience who is bringing them to that attention, and an individual who is highly zealous and religious and is confronted with their sin and doesn't like the messenger, so to speak. So both of them violated the law. Both of them highly religious. Both of them deeply devout to their beliefs. But when Ananias is confronted with his sin, and when the people are made aware of his sin, their response is to basically push it off onto another law, giving themselves justification for doing what they do. They don't own the fact that they violated the law. Instead, they deflect. But when Paul is brought to, when it's brought to his attention that he is in violation of the law, he stops and he was like, my bad. And he has to own it. And this is something that Jesus had talked about the presence of the Holy Spirit would convict the world of sin. And in this case, Paul, being filled with the Holy Spirit, is being convicted of his sin, and he owns it. Now, how does this have application today? Well, the book of Proverbs goes on in numerous places, and it talks about basically this distinction between the fool and the wise, and how we're not to rebuke a fool. And if you rebuke a fool, he'll hate you for it. And basically what it's talking about rebuking is talking about correcting. If you go to a fool and you're like, hey man, you're messing up here, the guy's just going to get defensive. He's going to hate you for it. It's going to sever the relationship and so on and so forth. But if you rebuke a wise man, that wise man will thank you for it. He will be appreciative of the fact that, you know what, I messed up. Thanks for setting me on the right course here. We have to be very careful as Christians to make sure that when we respond to correction, that we're responding in the Spirit and not in the flesh, regardless of whether or not we like the audience, regardless of whether or not we like the messenger that is bringing the information to us. I don't see a whole lot of case where, throughout the book of Acts, where individuals are trying to kind of fluff up the message, so to speak, to make it a little bit more softer or palatable or anything like that. What I see is people who are going out there and who are just giving the information. And you are either going to accept the information, and through the power of the Holy Spirit, you're going to turn that inward and you're going to be like, do I actually do that? Or you're just going to reject it and you're going to be that fool who has 20/20 vision outward to everyone else's problems, but you're utterly and completely blind looking inward. And this kind of came to me because it was probably a year ago. I had an individual, you guys obviously know I'm on YouTube. I had an individual contact me who I really do not like. He's another YouTube personality that I have zero respect for. But he contacted me, and as we kind of debated, on a messenger thing back and forth about issues, he hit with a couple of things that I actually had to kind of pause and think about. Even though I fundamentally disagreed with a lot of the things that he said, there was a couple of things that he said about me that he was not wrong. I had to take and reflect, and I had to ask myself, you know what? I actually am guilty of those things, and I had to take that and internalize that and change some ways, change the way in which I kind of acted in certain circumstances. The point being is this: if we are always just going to push away a messenger because we don't like the individual, you're not going to ever get the message. The Pharisees did that with Jesus. They didn't like the message that they got, not because the message itself was wrong. They didn't like the message that they got because they didn't like Jesus. By the same token, the same thing is happening here with Paul and the rest of the apostles and the prophets in the Old Testament. People had problems with these individuals, so therefore they completely disregarded the message that was coming to them, didn't give it its fair take, didn't evaluate it, didn't ask themselves internally, do I do those things? Am I guilty of those things? Instead, they just made excuses, they deflected, they found other ways of justifying their actions, and as a result, they became the fool of Proverbs, who hate the individual who is bringing them correction, yet despite the fact that even though that individual may have meant it harmfully to you, it doesn't change the fact that that correction was in fact useful. So once you guys kind of look at this passage and ask yourselves, maybe ask yourselves some hard questions. If you are Christians and stuff, we cannot become the fool. That is something that we cannot do. The Holy Spirit is there to guide us and direct us and to make sure that we don't. So don't silence that. Don't hush it. Don't justify it. Don't push it away. If the Holy Spirit is bringing you conviction on something, regardless of whether or not you like the messenger, we need to stop and take a second and hear it. So anyway, God bless, guys.